Daggone. All righty. So for some reason, my intro and my countdown didn't run this time. That's kind of crazy. We're just here we go. Like everything is just so surprise. Here we go. At least I think so. It says that we're live. So yep. Okay, now we're live. There we go. Yeah, my countdown video and intro video didn't play this time, which is really weird. I don't know why it didn't do that. So that was really strange. But so all right, everybody, welcome back. It's been a couple of weeks or so. So Adam is back with me again for part 4 of the Torah series here. And today, everybody's favorite thing to fight about: should we be Torah compliant or not? And we also have some help from Adam's cat. I love it. That's awesome. That's
Sorry, I was on
great.
mute. Yeah, apparently I
That's
was
all
trying to,
right.
before we went live, I was trying to get this. That is actually my cat
Yeah,
perched up
awesome.
there.
All right. So
So,
anybody who's joining us hasn't been here before and is just jumping into this series. Adam, why don't you introduce yourself? Who are you? Where can we find you? And what you know about the Old Testament and Torah?
yeah. I'm Adam. I run the YouTube channel Linguas Amo, where I focus mainly on Old Testament stuff. We nerd out on Old Testament stuff over there, whether it's history, archaeology, or language. We do delve into some theology a little bit. I've had that channel for about 2 years now. If you want to go check it out, it's Linguas Amo, spelled every letter is pronounced in that, so easy to remember. I have a master's degree in biblical studies from Liberty University, and I'm currently pursuing a second master's degree at Biola University, which is a little more focused and specific in the Old Testament. Hopefully, with PhD coming, which is my end goal, and narrow that down even further into the Pentateuch and probably a certain book. So I'm Exodus or Genesis is what I'm thinking of when it comes to that. In a nutshell, that's me and my cat, Zelda, if you want to know her name. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Awesome.
that's
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, I'm always glad to have you on. We always have a good time. We've had a lot of fun doing this
Hmm.
Torah series.
Yeah.
But you get us Old Testament nerds together, and we just love to talk about all this geeky stuff. And hopefully, it's been helpful, kind of going through and talking about all the different parts of Torah. So today we've gotten to, like I said, the more controversial part of Torah of, as Christians now in 2025, should we be Torah compliant? And I know there's a lot of fighting about this. It goes back and forth. Yes, we should. No, we shouldn't. And I think um, and we'll get to this at the end. There seems to be some confusion, and there also seems to be some people bringing in some systematic assumptions into these arguments. So we're going to try to do what we do here and back up from all of that and just dive into the narrative and walking through as much as we can, stepping outside of those preconceived biases, because I'm not. It's not. I think by now anybody who's watched my channel for a while has figured out I am not a huge fan of systematic theology. I'm not a huge fan of overly defining and overly pigeonholing and overly, you know, getting too caught up in understanding what's going on. From that way, I like I love the ability to hold things in tension and to be able to embrace the messiness. So I'm not a fan of systematic theology. So not having to have a systematic to understand all this stuff, I think, is helpful for me anyway. So that's kind of where we start. So, but Torah compliance. First, we're going to define some terms because that's one of the other things that we do around here. So, compliance. When you look at, I think I have Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines
Mm.
compliance as the act or process of complying to a desired, demand, proposal, or regimen, or to a coercion, or conformity in fulfilling official requirements. So that is the definition of the word compliance. So, Adam, let's walk us through really quickly, kind of, because we've done 3 videos now on Torah. So kind
Mhm.
of walk us through what is, going back to the very first episode, what is Torah? Because this word has a lot of meanings, and so we needed to understand what it is we're trying to figure out what we're complying to before we figure out if we're complying with it.
Absolutely. There's a whole lot of misconceptions and misleading terms as far as defining what Torah is, and simply it is just instructions. They're instructions on how to live, at least more specifically in the Old Testament, how to live a holy life that is pleasing to God. I like the this second definition, where conforming and fulfilling official requirements. I'm not so keen on, I mean, if it's God's law, it's going to be official. I guess is what I'm trying to say. But I like the conforming part of that definition that you gave. Not so much the A definition, but the B
Mhm.
definition. So, uh, and we see that throughout the first 5 books of um, sorry, I thought I heard something. So we see that laid out in books like Leviticus, Numbers, and told again in Deuteronomy, where they're about to enter the promised land. So with some minor modifications with that is because of the
Mhm.
shift from wilderness to actual land. So, and then we see that throughout the Old Testament as well, the Torah. So, that it's most basic definition. It's just a set of instructions, and it's teaching us how to rightly live, and live rightly in relationship with God.
And I think some of the confusion, Adam, that we, and people can go back and watch our first episode. Um, Man, I got that buzzing thing. It's really loud here. Hang on.
Mm, yeah.
That Torah, that confusion, because sometimes the way it's translated or the way that it's referenced in the New Testament, sometimes it's talking about the 10 commandments. Sometimes Torah
Mhm.
is talking about the first 5 books of the Bible. Sometimes
Yeah.
Torah, I mean, yeah. Oh, Deborah can hear the noise too. Yeah, I don't know what that noise is, Deborah.
I
I can't
I
figure it out.
can't hear it. I can't hear it on
Yeah.
my end,
I
but
don't know what that noise is. I was trying to figure it out before when I've started hearing it. I don't know what the noise is. It comes and goes. My apologies. I don't know what that noise is. If somebody knows what that noise is and can tell me, um, I would love to fix it, but I don't know what it is, so I can't fix it when I don't know what the noise is. So I don't want to touch and break anything because that happens to me
yeah.
sometimes. So, I'm sorry about the noise. I don't know what to do about it. It's I don't know where it's coming from. So I thought it was just in my headset, but apparently not because Deborah can hear it as well, apparently. So doggone, that makes me a little frustrated. But we will continue on as best we can with the noise. So there's some confusion in this use of the word Torah and the way it's translated as law sometimes, and that
Mhm.
sometimes it comes from Greek, and sometimes that comes from translation bias, sometimes that comes from like historical evolution of just how theology has systematized things and gotten us off track of understanding things sometimes. There's a whole bunch of reasons why this term gets really confusing, but for us, we are just simply talking about the 613 instructions
Mhm.
in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. There's some in Numbers, but that's what we're talking about is those living instructions giving to the Israelites. That's what we're
Mhm.
talking about here. So, sorry. And so as we go through, are we supposed to be compliant with those instructions? Well, let's talk about the role of those instructions again, just to kind of review what were they there for. Okay. So I've heard, I don't know, Adam, I don't know if you've heard this, but I have heard this before. God gave the Torah to show us that we couldn't keep it, especially in the Old Testament. God gave them Torah because he wanted to show them that they couldn't keep it, that they couldn't earn their salvation, that it wasn't enough to save them. Like God just gave it to them and set them up to fail. And that one of the roles of that is that we need a savior, right? I mean,
Mhm.
somebody has
I've
taught people this.
I've heard it taught in my church, my local church
Mhm.
here in Florida. I've heard it over and over and over again that they try and link it up with Galatians, where Paul
Mhm.
says the law is our teacher. Um, I've heard others, especially I'm going to throw a name out. Now I'm blank. I had a name in mind. Now I'm blanking. The Kiwi. I can't think of
Mm.
his name.
I know who you're talking about. I didn't remember his name either.
I can't think of his name. Someone will pop up in the chat probably. But he uses the law specifically for that, that you couldn't keep it. He goes through each of the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, and
Mhm.
he tries to expose some sort of sin in their life and then see you need a savior. And then Jesus, I think he's one of the good examples. His names drive me nuts. But um, yeah. So I think he's an example of that definition, or at least he tries to use that definition and then apply it in his videos on YouTube because he's a huge YouTube following.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I don't know, but I've heard that it makes me
it's
cringe every time I hear it.
it's print.
People
It
like to
is. It
abuse
is.
and people like to abuse Romans to justify that position too, which we're gonna
Yeah.
get to that at the end of
Yeah.
this episode. We're gonna address that a little bit here, but Torah is, that in and of itself, if you're gonna take that position, you've got a problem with Deuteronomy 30:11, and God says, "What I am commanding you, this Torah, is not too difficult for you," and then continues to elaborate that they have the choice to keep those instructions or not. And so if you say that he's setting them up to fail by giving them something that they cannot do, you're calling God a liar and you have a problem. So we are saying that um, these were not set up to fail. This is not a proof case of why we need a Messiah. That's not what Torah was initially, was set up to do. Okay.
Yeah.
It was, so you have to go back and remember a couple of things, right? So, first of all, what made you an Israelite under Torah, Adam? Because it's a very simple thing. What actually made you an Israelite under Torah?
What made you an Israelite under Torah wasn't really the genealogies at all. It was complying to God's law. That's it. If you
Mhm.
complied with God's law, you were in. Um, they had other sets of rules there to incorporate you into a clan, so to speak. But ultimately, if you were compliant with the laws, if you were doing the commands and statutes that the Lord your God gave you, you were in. You were being compliant.
Right. So basically, they'll tell you right in there, to be an Israelite, you had to be circumcised, or if you were a female, the
Mhm.
wife or daughter of a circumcised male, and you had to participate in the Passover or the feasts every year. Like, it's that
Hmm.
simple.
That was it.
Anybody,
At
there
least
was a
one.
process to come in, right, right. Passover was the most important one
Yeah.
for the feast to participate in. Passover was the one you were required to do. There were 3, but if you could only make one, Passover was the one you were to go to. So, if you
Hmm.
were circumcised or the wife or daughter of a circumcised male and you followed and participated in the Passover every year, you were an Israelite. End of story. It's as simple as that. Because, we talked about before, coming out of Egypt, that was not just the family of Abraham. There was a mixed group there. They were collecting people all
Deuteronomy
along the
7:7.
way. Yes, the book of Numbers, you're adding all kinds of people through Joshua, Judges. They're picking people up all over the place. So, it was not just only the children of Abraham. So, so then if you think about going back to this idea where God in the Old Testament is giving them this to set them up this veil, to show them that they need a Messiah and all of this stuff. If you want to, I think some of that comes from, we have this idea where it's an understanding of something we think, and we'll read something in the Old Testament, and then we'll go back and read it in the Old Testament. And I think we do that backwards sometimes. I think it's really important when you're starting to get in and studying and understanding. You need, that's why canonical narrative, or just, reading the narrative from the beginning to end, is so important. Because if you have the grand story in your head and you
Yeah.
do a step back and get the bigger overview, that it is the old is a continuation of the new. So you don't see them throw out the old in the new. It's not like, okay, guys, we got the backstory, we'll take it from here. And Paul and Peter and the apostles and Luke don't, we're like, okay, thanks guys, we got this, we're chucking all this out, now we're going on to a brand new thing here. you don't ever see that. You never see any of them say that. And so it is important to understand the new by understanding the so yeah, you'll hear sometimes too, Adam, I've heard this before. I heard this in one class where to understand the new, you start with the old and you go and then you up to the New Testament and then you're done. But I think this is where like the role of intertextuality is something called intertextuality is so important because you got to go back and forth because you got the old and then the New Testament authors will reinterpret the old through Christ and then you can go back and look at it. So it's going back and forth and being fluent in both gives you a better understanding of the whole. So yeah, so what are your thoughts on that? Because I've run
No,
into this a lot.
I've actually, honestly, I've never heard of that one, but
Mm.
I can definitely see the confusion. You don't just stop at the end of the Old Testament. I think you were spot on with that. You need to continue through into the New Testament, and then you have to figure out. It even reads in there in the New Testament. Oh, Paul quotes Isaiah. You have in the Gospels. They're quoting like various books like Micah, Isaiah, again Jeremiah. Um,
Mhm.
they're reinterpreting or they're interpreting the Old Testament in light of Christ. Exactly. And you see that time and time again. So just to stop the Old Testament right after the book of Micah, according to the Protestant canon, if you will, um, you're really doing yourself a disservice as far as trying to understand the larger picture, which includes the Old Testament. I think that is something that is I want to say misleading, but it's definitely in the wrong direction when I see churches do that and they only focus on the New Testament because they're missing all of the other stuff in the Old Testament. I think one of my old churches did that, and it was just Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. We're not even going to focus on
Mhm.
Torah, which I thought was a grave mistake. Great mistake is what I would say. But um, yeah.
Yeah, then we had every Old Testament's, nemesis who came out with that great unhitching from the Old Testament line that
Oh
all
yes.
of us cringe over every single time we hear it.
Every time.
No.
Every
And I
time.
think biblical studies and scholarship, modern scholarship has added to this confusion by breaking
Hmm.
it into Old Testament studies and New Testament studies,
New
and
Testament.
you don't see this interdisciplinary view very often because you specialize in the old or you specialize in the new
Yeah.
and there's a break. And I've one of the
Right.
things I've noticed that's kind of frustrated me being an Old Testament major and studying the Old Testament, it's like you're right, it stops at Micah or Chronicles depending on which order you use. It stops there and we're done. We don't get into the Second Temple or the intertestamental period and all that stuff that those books that set Protestants on fire when they try to read them, right? And if you're a New Testament major, you'd start sorry, I have
That was
thoughts
good.
on the
That was good.
Apocrypha, but um, but New Testament studies, it picks up from, you know, John John the Baptist, John the Baptizer, John the Forerunner, whatever you want to call him. It starts there and and they have their own pocket and sometimes they will pull from the contemporary literature of the time of the New Testament, but I had my Old Testament biblical theology professor over and over and over and over again used to say, "Show me where a New Testament scholar is wrong, and I'll tell you exactly where he doesn't know the Old Testament." And I'm like, it just plays out all the time. I see this all the time with when people get stuff wrong in the New Testaments because they misunderstand
Very
something in the Old. So
the old
we've
one.
done a disservice breaking them apart in scholarship and in biblical studies too. So because it is just one big story, it's one giant narrative that tells the story of God garden to garden wanting to dwell with his people, and that's it doesn't need to be it can be that simple. That's one of the things I love about this, about the Bible is that simple, but it's also infinitely complicated that you never get to the end of it. So anyway, we're going to rabbit trail here if we're not careful. So, um, so
Guidelines.
understanding that the New Testament authors are well versed in the Old and understand what's going on. One of Paul's central arguments in the book of Romans, here we go, we're going to tackle and wade into the Romans
Here we
war here
go.
for for a minute.
Oh
All
dear.
right. one of Paul's central arguments in Romans is that there is a distinction between God giving and God and people receiving. So I can give you a gift, Adam, but you don't have
Mhm.
to take it. You're not
Right. Yeah.
obliged to take it, right? And so that's one of
Mhm.
the things that Paul is arguing throughout the entire book. God is giving us a gift. God is giving us the Messiah as a gift. They don't have
Mhm.
to accept that because of their history in the Old Testament. They've already seen what happens when they refuse the gifts of God. That didn't go well for you, which is a lot of Romans 9 is look, you knuckleheads. Hang on, I got noise again. Um,
All right.
you know, you saw what happened before when you received God's gift or when you refused God's gift. Don't make the same mistake again with Christ. And then what do? They make the same mistake. So, it's not that Paul is saying this Old Testament thing is dead. We don't need it anymore. We're chucking it out. He's saying, no, God is giving you the ultimate result of that gift is Christ. Don't be stupid and repeat the mistakes that they made before. So that's
Mhm.
where, um understanding your Old Testament and reading Paul, understanding your Old Testament, I think helps with some of that context. So, Adam, why don't you jump in and get in trouble with, with
Okay.
the rest of us in Romans here?
Um, I think I'll back away. No, I'm just kidding. Honestly, I with the Romans thing, I'm right there with you with Romans because that is exactly how Paul describes it in Romans. It's this gift that you should wisely accept. You shouldn't just reject it. Look at past everything, especially with the Old Testament, or not the Old Testament, the Torah, where they went wrong. First they accepted it, and then they kind of deviated away from it. And in the New Testament, you don't even have the acceptance, at least according to the Jews. You just have them outright rejected, except for 12. And then the 12 kind of, you know. So, as far as Romans and Paul is concerned, as far as the gift of salvation, I think you summed that up beautifully. Um, the whole garden to garden things. But I really don't have any much words because the way you explained it. So I was gonna delve into the Galatians and stuff as far as the
Okay.
teaching, the Torah teaching,
Yeah. Go ahead.
is our teacher to Christ. It points to Christ is what the Torah does, and that's what Paul was getting at in the book of Galatians, as well as putting off the old self and then the fruits of the Spirit in chapter 5. That the whole book is about what Torah teaching, pointing to Christ. Is what Torah is. It's not about what did you say? What did we say earlier? It's not about it's about conforming, but it wasn't
Mhm.
about to show that we could not keep it. That's what it was.
Right.
That we could not keep it. And I think Paul re echoes that again in Galatians. It's not just in Romans, but it's also in Galatians that he echoes that. Um, so you could even look. I don't know. Maybe I'm off the hinges here, but you could even look at Torah as a gift as well, like Jesus was, since he fulfilled the law. So that's where I was going to go with it.
Okay. I'm gonna try and turn these off and just I don't know if there'll be background noise from the speaker or what, but I might try that. But so if you could talk about while I'm playing with that a little bit, so that the Old Testament or in Torah is I kind of lost my place here in my notes
Yeah,
that oh yeah. So that it is you got to look at blessings and curses and this idea of
yes,
accepting a gift and refusing a gift goes along with that blessings and curses. So if you could like riff on that for a second while I try to
yeah,
fix the headphone problem,
absolutely.
we'll see if that will
So,
work. Okay, hang on.
what's going on in Deuteronomy here? Deuteronomy and Leviticus is they were at the mountain. I'm just going to go through some stuff. You guys well, more than likely, hopefully, you know all this already. But um, what's going on is they're receiving Torah in Leviticus. They're at the mountain. They're in the wilderness. They're actually at Sinai. They're receiving God's instructions. And in academia we call this a suzerain vassal treaty is what we call it. So what that means is that you had a more powerful empire take on a smaller vassal, if you will, and there would be a treaty between the two saying we will tribute so much, or we will um, pay tribute, or we will follow you, you will lead, and in return you will offer protection. That's what the suzerain vassal treaty is in a nutshell. In the ancient Near East, you see this with the Neo-Hittite treaties, and you see this with Egypt as well, where there's this suzerain vassal treaty going on. So that's what's echoed here and is specifically laid out in Deuteronomy here, where you have curses and blessings, which are usually at the end, and then there are usually eyewitnesses that kind of wrap up this treaty, if you will. And so the blessings and curses is if you're more specifically with the Old Testament, if you're compliant with Torah, if you're compliant with these instructions, then you will receive blessings. Your land will prosper, your cattle will prosper, etc., etc. But if you are not compliant with these instructions, then the land will be cursed, and then eventually exiled. And that's what we see when you get to the prophets. So in the prophets, Isaiah's warning them, the weeping prophets warning them, eventually in Ezekiel, and then you get to Ezekiel, and then Ezekiel's like, well, I guess we're exiled. He witnesses the king, you know, his he witnesses the king's sons killed and then eyes gouged out. You see that though played out in the Old Testament. So that is more of what is going on there as far as the blessings and curses.
Right. So basically it's like when we see the blessings and curses, it's not about eternal life. It's about the fertility of the land, it's about good crops, it's about staying in their land, it's about human flourishing. And the bad stuff is if you don't keep the Torah, then that stuff's all gonna stop and you might get tossed out of the land. And that
Yes.
in the context of the Old Testament, ancient Near Eastern world, the land is everything. The land is your identity, it is your deity, it is your survival. It is, I mean, the land you can't overemphasize the importance of land in especially in the Old Testament. So, good. I think it was my headphones apparently, because now it's fine.
Uh,
So, I don't know what's going on with my headphones, they've never done that before, it's really annoying, but so we're gonna do the best we can, and hopefully they can't hear you in the background because I have you on a speaker instead of in my
oh,
headphones.
okay. I don't
So,
hear an echo, so
okay, well, I have it turned down so I can, like, I have to really, like, listen and pay attention, but okay, so now we're gonna get into that we've kind of gotten all that context set up.
mhm.
Should we follow Torah? Should we be compliant? Are we supposed to
Yes.
be compliant now after Jesus? Because Jesus comes and renews the covenant and changes it and fulfills it into, that everything goes through him, right? So, um, and Jesus himself says that, one not one jot or tittle, not one mark or stroke of Torah is going to pass away, right? And here's the fun thing about Hebrew, right? So Hebrew, because it usually just uses the consonants, but for non-native readers or to preserve pronunciation, they added all of those markings, right, on there. And so that people could know how to pronounce it if you weren't a native speaker and didn't just know these words based on the consonants. Right? And so and there's even letters in Hebrew that look like weird marks, like the yod, right?
Yeah.
So, none of those are going to change. So nothing in Torah is going away and nothing in Torah is changing, right? So if Torah is about the defining the identity of Israel in the Old Testament. And Jesus says it doesn't change and it doesn't pass away. So now in Christ, this is the um the definition of God's people now after Christ. So in Christ, this is going to be what kind of defines us. So why in the world? Because Torah is kept in Christianity. We didn't chuck it
Mhm.
out. They haven't The early church didn't chuck it out. They didn't I would posit that that didn't really come about until certain people in about 1600 getting together, deciding they didn't like the way things were going, chucked out Torah, right? We won't name any names. But, so this is not a thing that has been for most of Christian history a thing. So Adam, why are we saying that, and what does that mean for having to follow Torah?
But what does it mean to follow Torah? It means that
Well,
go ahead.
yeah, well, I mean, it's like if we're not throwing out Torah, that it's part of our Christian identity. So
Mhm.
what does that mean for rethinking this conversation about being Torah compliant?
Well, if we chuck it out, it that would be following the curses part, I would imagine, in a nutshell.
Right?
But we're just going to receive all these curses, if you will, if we're not going to be compliant with Torah. It also shows that we're not loving Christ because Christ or Jesus
Mhm.
himself said that if you love me, follow my commands. And Jesus followed the Decalogue. He followed the Decalogue. So we should imitate him because he followed the Decalogue, or because he followed the Decalogue, so should we. And by expressing our love for Christ, we should follow the Decalogue as well. Um, that's
Right, because Torah, like we talked about, defined Israel, and now in Christ, it
mhm,
defines, who we are as Christians, as believers, right? So,
yeah,
in the Old Testament, it's defining this new nation, and it's covering economic life, dress, diet, farming practices, commerce, political
yeah.
structures, all of that is described in Torah. So, are we saying that all of that gets trucked in? Well, this is where I think that Greek and the Septuagint is gonna help us out a little bit here. So I asked you to pull this up. So
Yes.
in the Septuagint, there is, this idea that is used here when Torah gets translated using the word nomos, right? And it's so
Yes.
the Greek word nomos, and I'm just gonna say this one thing, and then I'm gonna let you kinda nerd out
Okay.
on nomos with us for a minute. So
All right.
nomos is the idea of a whole way of life of people, which is liturgy, which I have been banging on this for a while now. Torah is liturgy. It is a way of life of Israel. So if that's the case and Greek is nomos, talk to us about that word and how that's going to pull into the New Testament when it moves over.
Absolutely. Here we go. So I'm going to start with uh, well, who cares? I'll just start with the first lex. I was going to name it, but it doesn't matter. So the nomos, which is the Greek word for law, it's a really complicated word, or at least the definition for it's really long. But anyway, it according to the BDAG, which is the standard, it is a procedure or practice that has taken hold, a custom, rule, principle, or norm. So it's much more than just following law. It seems like it's woven into the fabric of society, is what this definition seems to take. Um, and then it goes through a bunch of other stuff. It's life under the lordship of Jesus Christ as a new law. If we're translating this word from the Septuagint into the New Testament, from the Old into the New, it is a system of conduct that constitutes an unwritten tradition. Um, it is a system requiring faith. Um, So that's the BDAG definition of it. And we can use another one. It goes a little more. Again, it's called, a law, a norm. It's conforming to the law according to the rule. What was it? Yeah. The nomos also can refer to processes that are essential for humans to live together in a community. So you get the communal aspect of the word. Relationships to earthly possessions must be determined in a legally binding fashion. There it is, woven into society and the law, so that private and communal ownership may be a reality. This is covering the verb nomos, which is nomo or nemo. It can covers business. It can cover business apparently. Um, it can cover distribution. I just lost my it distributing something and what followed from it. So the Torah was distributed to us, and we follow it. Um, yeah, it meant that it was laid down or ordered, and then it just goes on and on and on with the definitions. I don't want to exhaust the whole word, but we'll be here until the sun sets on the East Coast, which is roughly 3 hours. But anyway, uh, so
It's one of those great
it's
words, but it
woven.
sounds to
Yeah.
me like nomos in is transliterated Nomos is the
Yes.
transliteration of
Yeah.
that word,
I'm
right?
sorry. Did
So
I forgot to
it
say that? Yeah,
sounds
that's
to
my fault.
me like I was right on before that it is
Yep.
encompassing of the whole way of life
It
is what
is.
this
Yep.
is bringing that meaning with it, right? So we've got
Unfortunately
we've
for the
got Torah that is defining a way of life and an identity. And if we're not throwing out Torah because Jesus says it doesn't pass away and none of it's going to change, it's going
yep.
to define our lives as Christians too, in a way. So, but we have to hold this in balance. Again, we're going back to throwing out systematics and embracing messiness and holding things in tension.
Mhm.
So, when we go back and look at what Christ is saying, because that's really where our starting guide kind of needs to be here in being Torah compliant. Jesus, when he's asked by I can't remember because I forgot to write it down, but Jesus is asked the two most important commandments or the most important commandment, and Jesus responds, "Love God, love your neighbor." Okay,
Correct. Yeah.
that's just a summary of that. There's more words to that, but basically, love God, love your neighbor. So it stands to reason, I would think, that Torah instructions about how to love God and how to love your neighbor are excellent guidelines of how we are supposed to be Torah compliant in the sense of following instructions, right? So
Hmm.
but we're gonna nuance this language a little bit by the time we get to the end. So right now we're just using Torah compliance because it's where we started, but we're gonna nuance that at the end, I think, a little bit more. But just for the sake of people following the conversation, we're just gonna stick with those words for now. But which is right, and we're gonna jump into that right about now because
Right.
how do we do that? Because these are excellent guidelines for how to love God and how to love your neighbor when you boil them down and look at especially like the 10 commandments and a bunch of the there's a bunch of instructions in Exodus is a really good place to look when there's at Sinai. That part is really good about defining a lot of this, right? But what does that mean if are we required to keep them? This is where we're going to get into the compliance word a little bit, right? So are we to be compliant? Does that mean we are required to keep them? I am going to say that Ezekiel, Romans, and Hebrews are going to help us out here with understanding if we are required to keep Torah as Christians, right? So when you go back, especially when you look at Ezekiel, and Romans 5 is really helpful here. But looking at Ezekiel 36, 37, what Ezekiel 36 and 37 does is you've got the imagery and the vision of Israel being so dead, spiritually dead, just dead, that it is a pile of dead, dry, dusty bones. Like there is no way that Israel's faking dead. Like they're dead, dead. And the Spirit comes and resurrects Israel and puts Israel back together and creates Israel, resurrects Israel, right? And so that is the beginning image, and that is one of the first clear places that we see what's happening in the Gospels. Like Ezekiel 37 is the gospel before Jesus. Like I would
Mhm.
that's a hill I will
It
die on
is. Yeah.
right there.
No, it is. Yeah. 100%.
Um Right, so when you get to Romans and Hebrews, especially, these 2 books, and they talk about this, when you understand that, before, under what they're calling, and we'll use, under the understanding of the Old Covenant, right, before Christ, you were obligated to the weight of compliance for that. You were obligated to the weight of guilt. There was a lot of weight on that. Okay. But what happens in especially Romans 5, and Hebrews also talks about this, is that carnal weight of a burden from the law. Through Christ, we are removed from. And now it is, we are creatures of spirit, because we go from being creatures of carnal, the dry bones, to being creatures of spirit, the resurrected Israel, which is what happens in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, is Ezekiel 37, right?
Yeah.
So, because of that, we are not linked to the carnal responsibility and weight of guilt in the law. But as part of this gift giving, because a big part of relationship is giving gifts back and forth. So God gives us the gift a lot out of his overabundance. God gives us gifts all of the time. And in a loving relationship, we are not required, but in love, because I love God, I want to give gifts back in gratitude and thankfulness. That's where all of the offerings and the wave offerings and the gratitude offerings and all that stuff in there all has to do with a way of me to express my love and gratitude back to God in this loving relationship he wants to have with us, right? So, in that same spirit, I just lost my place again. All right. So, we don't have to because we're creatures of spirit. In loving response to God, we want to give back because we're in good relationship. How do we stay in relationship? Well, I don't think there's a lot of room that's left in the New Testament because they understand that Torah already explains that, right?
Mhm.
So Adam, let's like break down a little bit for me, like thinking about like, so how do we transfer that over if we're not bound in the carnal anymore because of the resurrection of Christ, which is explained in 37, Ezekiel 37. And
Mhm.
Paul talks about this in all through Romans, but Romans 5, he hits this hard. And the book
Yeah.
of Hebrews talks about it moves the weight. Maybe this is where I really would like maybe to hear from you on this, like the book of Hebrews, because it talks about transferring from you got the transfer from the previous messengers to Jesus bringing the word, and Jesus is the ultimate word. So he's the greater word. And then the
Yeah.
transfer of the priesthood, or, from Aaron to Melchizedek, and then and then Christ is the greater offering for us. So we're not going to get into atonement again because we've already stepped on that
Oh,
one
the sin
before. But
offering.
right, with the
Jesus is the sin offering, not
offerings and all
sin.
that. So how does Hebrews help us with this? Because we got Romans that is saying, nope, we are not creatures of the carnal, we are creatures of the spirit. But people are going to point to Hebrews and go, but Hebrews says the law is not valid anymore. Well,
Yeah.
I no.
Which seems like it's contradicting what Jesus' own words when he says
Mhm,
he fulfilled the law. He's come to fulfill the law, not do away with it. Um, so when we're reading Hebrews, yeah, Jesus is our high priest. He's after the order of Melchizedek, which is laid out in Genesis 14, and then Hebrew or not Hebrews, Psalm 104 or 110. I was confused. I think Psalm 110 talks
It's
about
110.
Melchizedek.
Yeah, 110.
Um, yeah, 110. Okay, I was right. I confused 104 with 110. I don't even know why. They're not even related. Well, they are because in Psalms. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. So, with Hebrews, and as far as following the order of Melchizedek, we are children of spirit now. I think the author of Hebrews, whoever that is, whether it's Paul, Apollos, or whatever, I think it's Apollos. But I thought Hebrews rather just spells that out, that we are no longer children of carnality, but children of spirit. I
Mhm.
think he weaves that in there with, as far as Jesus being the high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Um, I just don't see any other way to around that. But on the if you look at it prima facie, I will say, yeah, it looks like Jesus, or the author of Hebrews is contradicting Jesus' words. But if you look deeper, it's just not the case. That he came to fulfill the law because he may have I forget the verse he's saying it. I think that's why I'm kind of like doing that because I'm trying to think of the verse in Hebrews 5.
Hmm. Well, I always found it really
Um,
interesting that there's a lot of imagery going on there, but moving the priesthood from Aaron to Melchizedek takes it out from under the law of Moses. It puts it back to with the faith of
yeah,
Abraham where it belongs. It
yeah,
resets.
it resets. So it's not like the Zadokite priesthood or the Aaronic priesthood anymore. It's the order of
Mhm.
Melchizedek, and Melchizedek was the type of Christ. Anyway, at least that's what we'll all call it. That Melchizedek was the type of Christ to come, also bread and wine, which you can put to anyone who has maybe a brain cell can put that together with bread and wine, what that may look like. So um, you got that imagery going on there. You got that imagery going on. I'm really struggling here with this. Um,
Well, that's okay. I kind of threw you a
where
curveball there.
you did, I didn't expect this one. Um, own that one. I didn't expect it.
Sorry, I did.
So,
Well, I've
but
got Hebrews in my head because my final project for New Testament interpretation was Hebrews 9. So I've got like
oh,
Hebrews
that's
is like
why
big in my head right now. So
we were in Zechariah.
like
We were in Zechariah at the end. Zechariah and Daniel is where we were at the end. I've,
yeah, I think just I think that we've done enough there with just the imagery of moving. We are moved from what Christ's atonement does. And I'm gonna
yeah,
like I'll take the hit on this one too, because why not? We're
yeah,
already taking the hit
we're
on
already here.
redefining Torah. So what
Yeah,
what what Christ's atonement does is it takes us from the carnal to becoming creatures of spirit.
yeah,
Ezekiel 37. That's what Christ's atonement does. It removes us from that carnal death and brings us into creatures of life. It moves us from creatures of Ra to creatures of Tav. It puts us back where we belong, where God created us. Like, right? It removes that from that whole setup there, right? And so I don't want to bang on that too long because we could get stuck on atonement and create another atonement war, which we don't want to get into at all.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
so what this does, since we're relationship with Christ, is participatory, right?
Hmm.
Torah was participatory. You had to be circumcised, you had to participate in the Passover. There were impurity, rituals that had to, things that needed to be done to participate in relationship with God. Those don't go away because we still participate in relationship with Christ, right?
We're still doing
God
it
told
today.
us,
Yeah.
Christ told us, love God, love your neighbor. The 10 commandments, I think, are the best place. Well, I'm gonna step back for just one more second on that. Like,
Hmm.
so since our relationship with Christ is participatory, the results of that are honoring the spirit of Torah by being in loving relationship with God and with neighbor. We're freed from the requirements and the mandates of the offerings and sacrifices as means of participation and purification and atonement. Not what you're thinking, penal
Right.
substitutionary atonement. That's not what it is. Get that out of your head, right?
Please.
But participating in that worship liturgy is what it is, worship liturgy on an ongoing basis. So cows and sheep and goats, we don't need those anymore because Christ has removed that need,
Mm.
right? We're not saying that it doesn't, but not in a penal substitutionary atonement kind of way. That's not how it works. But because we're not required to do that part anymore, right? That doesn't what we do in this participating with relationship with Christ, what are we required to do now in Torah? Because Christ told us, love God, love your neighbor, which is where we're going to jump back up to. Yeah, there's a little
Yeah.
staticky, Roddy. I can't figure out what it is. I thought it was my headphones, so I took my headphones off, and now apparently it's still making some crackly noises. I don't know where it
Mm.
is. I can't figure it out. It's not my mic. It's not my headphones. I don't know. I must be having internet issues. I guess I don't know. I can't. I don't know where it's coming from. So I don't. It's a sound problem, and I can't figure it out. So we're just trying to make the best of it. So my apologies to anybody who stuck with us this long. It's made it through the noise. I don't know. If somebody knows about sound and can fix my sound my sound problem,
Right.
I would love that, but I don't know. Anyway, so we're gonna jump back to, because Christ talks about love God, love your neighbor. The best place to see that is in what we call, or what we refer to as, the 10 commandments, which are the 10, and you and I talked about this before.
Yeah.
It is the only thou shalt and thou shalt nots
Yep.
definitives in Torah. The rest of it are if then instructions, which
Characteristic.
goes back to the blessings and curses, which we already decided we still need to follow that spirit of that, right?
Yeah.
So the 10 commandments, Adam, walk through just really quickly. Loving God, loving your neighbor. What how does that work in participation relationship with God and with Christ? Like, how do those 10
It's
commandments kind of work in with that?
I think it's a great expression of how we're supposed to love our neighbor. In a nutshell, each one of them,
Mhm.
we get to, and it expresses how we love God. The first four are directed vertically, and then the last six, the latter six, are horizontally. So if we follow the 10 of them that way, then we are expressing in our best way loving God and loving our neighbor. So if you want to take do not steal, you are loving your neighbor by not stealing. You are loving your neighbor by not coveting. You are loving your spouse, who is also your neighbor, by not committing adultery. You are loving God by keeping the Sabbath. You are loving God by putting no other gods beforehand, by not taking his name in vain, which simply means not dropping an F bomb. It's loving, taking the Lord's name in vain is misrepresenting God. That's it. So if you're obeying all 10 commandments, you are loving God and your neighbor wholly as best as you can in your imperfect self. That's
Right. I
what it is.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you. I think that this means that, it tells us how to not be in bad relationship. We're supposed to be in good relationship, right? So, exactly like what you said, being in good relationship with your neighbor. I'm not going to steal their stuff. I'm not going to steal
Yeah.
their spouse. I'm not going to, misrepresent them in court or ruin their reputation, right? Because
Hmm.
that's a big part of the representing. And, I'm not gonna, be in loving relationship with God by worshiping something else instead of him or in front of him, and by misrepresenting his loving desire to be in relationship with us to others. So if I make God look bad, that's not me being in loving relationship with God. That's not how that works. So exactly. So, but I want to stop for a second, because this is another one of those arguments that people have been having for a really long time. Sabbath. Because a
Oh,
lot
dear.
of people are confused about the Sabbath. So, again, we are not definitive experts with the all end all answer for all of time. This is just kind of where we have landed in our looking at all of this stuff. So, we will get some stuff wrong, and you can disagree with us, and we would welcome anybody who disagrees with us, because that's kind of how this works. But we're going to talk about the Sabbath. So, and I don't want to spend a really long time getting bogged down here, but are we required to keep the Sabbath, Adam? What do you think?
Oh dear.
I'll go
Um,
first if you want, but
I would. I knew this was coming too, but we're supposed to find our rest in Jesus. That's the Sabbath. Um, you're he, come to me, all who labor heavy burden, and I will give you rest. Jesus is the Sabbath. So if you're finding your rest in Christ and Jesus, you are keeping the Sabbath. Um, so yeah,
okay, I'm going to go a little bit further than you on that one, which I totally agree with you, because I think
yeah,
you're right, because that was what the Sabbath was. The Sabbath,
there's many.
as if you look at Genesis 1, all right? Well, it's actually in 1, 2, and 3, I think, is where Sabbath is. It
Hmm.
laps over into chapter 2. Whoever did those chapter breakdowns didn't do us any favors. But when you look at the Sabbath, so you've got 6 days of creation, and then on the 7th day, God rested. Like, it's just not exactly like God went and took a nap. It's like God stepped back and enjoyed the process of creation, and being in relationship with his creation. So it was ceasing the daily, the activity that he had been in to enjoy participating with it, right?
Yeah.
So that is the Sabbath. And Jesus himself says the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Consequently, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. That's Mark 2:27 and 28, right?
Hmm.
So, what I think is what is happening here, because in this, and when Jesus comes and he's talking to Pharisees, and in general, he's talking to leadership, right? Because he's confronting the leaders of the Pharisees, because they're the ones getting everybody, you got to do what your boss says. So if the leadership of the Pharisees and you're just a lowly little, Pharisee or priest or scribe or somebody down here, you have to do what the above views are saying, right? So Jesus
Yeah.
is going after the leadership here. So this is not a blanket condemnation of every Pharisee ever for all time. He's going after the contemporary leadership, and he's rebuking legalism. What he is not rebuking is rest and worship, because the Sabbath is about a break from the normal to fully saturate yourself in worship and participation with God. That's what the Sabbath is for. The Sabbath is not a
Mhm.
checkbox on the list of thou shalt and thou shalt nots. It's
Right.
included there because God wants to emphasize its importance, but it's because it is that day of just, think about it as like a hot tub. Like, really, I mean, this is terrible analogy, but a hot tub is like you take a break and you just soak in it and you just absorb, like it's that kind of, in my head, it's the kind of idea. Like the Sabbath is meant for us to take a break from the normal, our normal routines. And so that's why now most Christian traditions have Sabbath on Sunday when they do their Sunday worships, because it's a break from our normal week. And we go and we just spend time focused on God in community. And that's what the Sabbath is supposed to do, is to take us out of our normal routine, get us into community and worshiping God together. So, should we participate in the Sabbath? Absolutely.
Yeah. Totally.
Um, okay, every time I move, we get static. Okay, so I will try not to move. I must have a connection problem somewhere. That must be it. It must be when I tap like something on the desk that sits that does feeds all my connectors. It
Gotcha.
must be I must have a bad junction box or something, so I might need to get a new one. Anyway, so Jesus is rebuking the legalism that the Pharisees
Right.
have
Yeah.
turned the Sabbath into. So when you're saying things like, if you walk so far, you're breaking Sabbath, like, but it got so ridiculous to be things like, if your job was to be a tailor and you had accidentally left a pin in your garment, you were working and violating the Sabbath. That's what Jesus
Yeah.
is rebuking. He's rebuking this, turning it into a burden. It
Yeah.
should never have been a burden. Sabbath was never meant to be a burden, and that's what Jesus is rebuking. He is not rebuking the Sabbath, he's rebuking the legalism that is interrupting their rest and their worship, participating with God. That's what Jesus is rebuking. So, are we supposed to be participating in Sabbath? I would say
Yes.
yes, because that is Christly wisdom. But here you go, Adam. Is it a sin, or does that mean you're not saved if you don't observe the Sabbath?
I would say it's participatory, but why would you not want to participate in acknowledging the Sabbath? So I guess my answer would be you don't have to. But why would you not want to? Why would you not want to delve into his word? Why would you not want to go to church on Sundays or Wednesday nights? Why would you not want to worship him not just limited on Sundays or Wednesdays, but every day of the week? Take your time out of the day, find your rest in him, participating in the Sabbath that way. That would be my answer. You don't have to, but it's odd and awkward if you don't. Especially if you claim Jesus as Lord, you should want to do that. So
Right.
that would be my answer.
I think it goes back to what we talked about being of the spirit, and that participating in that loving relationship with God is reciprocal gift giving. So God
Mhm.
gives us gifts out of his love and abundance. And observing Sabbath is a way, participating in Sabbath is a way for me out of my normal routine to focus and to give God a gift back of worship and praise and participation with him. So is it a sin? I don't, I don't, I would say no. Are you going to lose your salvation and go to hell if you don't, if you don't observe the Sabbath? I don't think so.
So
I think that it is Christly wisdom and participating fully in a loving relationship with God. It's a very wise thing to do.
it just seems
But are
like
you
you're
going to go to
building your
hell if you don't observe it? No.
it seems like you're building your foundation with wood, hay, and straw. Is what it
Yeah.
sounds like.
Right. We want to build our foundation on Christ and not on like sand or on,
Yes.
legalism never got anybody very far. Like look what happens that,
That's for sure.
Jesus goes nuts on the legalism with the leaders of the Pharisees. Like this is not going to work out well for them, and it's not going to work out well for us. Because you can't dictate your way into loving relationship. It doesn't work that way.
That
God
is
wants our hearts, not our heartless, mindless, blind obedience. That's a
yeah.
robot. God does not want robots.
He
God did
doesn't
not
want that.
create robots. God wants us
Now you
to
brought up free
participate,
will.
right? There goes that free will thing again. You're going
There
to
goes
get
that
us
free
back,
will thing
get
again.
back in trouble here.
Holy crap.
Right. So I think to kind of start the process of landing this plane and start summing things up. So
Yeah.
when so we start with Torah as the first 5 books of the Bible, right? And
Hmm.
um and as you watch, and this is why I am so so sold on, and I talk about all the time, the narrative of the Bible and talk about canonical narrative, why it's so important, because when you understand um the overall story of the Bible, everything sense realigns itself. And that's why I'm getting into studying canonical narrative got me out of systematic theology, because I'm like, so much of it doesn't fit when you understand the greater narrative and how it all interacts together, right?
Yeah.
So when you watch in the sequence of events emerging through the Hebrew scriptures, the latter part of the Christian Old Testament, what you get is this idea of the Messiah, and that David sets the benchmark for what the king looks like, and the prophets set the benchmark for what the prophet looks like, um, and then the priesthood is laid out, and you see all these things play out throughout the story of the Old Testament,
Hmm.
and that sets the benchmark for defining what Messiah is supposed to look like, because he's supposed to be a prophet, priest, king who does only what Yahweh can do. That's what the Messiah summed up in the Old Testament. That's what the Messiah is, what they were looking for, right? So the Old Testament in particular really needs to be known and understood by Christians, and not as a prologue to the New Testament, because the Old Testament, 2/3 or 3/4, depending on who you squabble with and what their math is like. The majority of the Protestant Bible is the Old Testament. So that's a very long prologue. I don't know about you, but that's a very
Yeah.
long
It's
prologue,
the longest one. Yeah. Longest one I've
right?
read.
Right. Because it's not a prologue to the New Testament, right? It's not that we've got all this Old Testament prologue stuff, and then John the Baptist shows up. All right, now it's time for the real story. That's not how that works.
Mhm.
Okay. You don't just be like, okay, that's good, and chuck out most of the Bible because the real story is starting now.
Yeah.
You don't, it's not a very good movie watching or series watching, right? If it's a 4-part
No.
series and you jump in at part 4, but you just
You're
watch
good.
the recap at the beginning to get the basic story as of the 3 episodes you missed before, you're gonna completely misunderstand the story, right? It's important to
Yeah.
participate in the entire story, right? And so when we understand that it's one story, right? It's not 2 stories. It's not like, because I've heard this before. I actually heard somebody say, "Yeah, thank you, Old Testament, for producing Jesus. We'll take it from here." Like,
Oh,
no,
I
that's
have
not
heard
what
that.
the New
Ugh,
Testament is saying at
so
all.
cringe. Yes, I have heard that one. That one I've heard. It's so cringe. So
Yeah,
cringe.
that's not what's going on. This is one story. That's why I started talking about garden to garden, because you got
Yeah.
Genesis to Revelation, garden to garden. This is a story. And in Christ, all of us participate in that story. So the Old Testament is our story. These are our fathers, just like they were Israel's, right?
Mhm.
These are our prophets. And these are also our failures. These are their story of our failures that got us where we are now. Okay.
Mhm.
So, like, and I wish that I could, like, I don't know, push a button and get people to kind of integrate this idea into their understanding of why the Old Testament matters, why Torah matters. It's because it's one, this is also our story.
Mhm.
In Christ,
Yeah.
this is our story. So, you have any thoughts you want to add in on any of that?
Um, Honestly, that was pretty cool. It's you're absolutely right. It's one story. They're linked. Like the Old Testament and the New Testament are connected. It's not, oh, the New Testament, well, Jesus is here. He's on the scene. He's going to do away with the Old Testament. We don't need it anymore. We can unhitch it, as someone said. And all this stuff in the New Testament is absolutely brand new, not based on anything. It's just based on Christ and his rightly living and blah 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 blah. And we don't need the Old Testament anymore. And that's a faulty way of thinking and looking at the Old Testament and just thinking that
Mhm,
they were created or in isolation. And that couldn't be farther from the truth, honestly. So without the old, you haven't got the new. So and Jesus and the disciples interpreted Jesus in light, or interpret Jesus, sorry. I almost said interpreted Jesus in light of the Old Testament. I had that backwards. Interpret the Old Testament in light of Jesus. So that's, and it goes even deeper than that with Torah, in that it's we're supposed to comply to it. We're supposed to be compliant through it, and let it can. We're supposed to conform to it, just like we're supposed to conform and imitate to Christ. So
mhm.
that's what I was going to say.
Right. And I think too, one of the things, and I don't know if we've mentioned this or not. I think it's in the next episode that we're gonna, so I'm gonna, a little bit of spoilers for
Yeah,
the last one is about Torah and Jesus, right?
yeah,
So we're gonna hit this really hard in the last episode. But Jesus is Torah.
yeah,
Jesus wrote Torah. Jesus gave them Torah. Like, if you're gonna say you don't not compliant with Torah, you've just thrown out Jesus. So you've got a
yep.
problem right there from the get-go. Right? So, we'll get into all of that Jesus is Torah stuff in the next episode. That'll be a lot of fun, I think, too. But, one of the things that I think that gets lost in this conversation of should we be Torah compliant or not, it goes back to, I think, this one of the reasons, well, the reason why I don't like systematic theology, because we like rules, we like order, we
Mm,
like things to be understandable. Sorry, I'm still getting over the last of my being sick. But we don't like messiness as people. We like things to be categorized. We like neat orders. We want our theology to check boxes and make sense. We want to understand how everything works. That's how our Western brains, they function on logic, on categorization, on systematizing, on understanding the mechanics. We love car manuals, we love documentaries, we love things that bring order
mm,
and make everything make sense. And I think the problem is, especially when we're dealing with anything related to God, that doesn't work,
no.
because God is not the author of confusion. God is the bringer of order. But
Yeah.
this is a fallen world and it's messy,
It is.
right? Things get messy fast in the Bible. You get 2 chapters of not messy and it goes off the rails and we still haven't gotten back on the
We
rails
haven't got
yet,
back to. Yep.
right? So expecting everything to fit nicely in order and everything to make sense, like so here you go, Adam. I mean, I have another question for you here. It's kind of another
Yeah.
curveball, but I know you can
Yeah.
answer this one pretty well too. So if in the ancient Near East mind, thinking back to the Old Testament authors and the people who are living in that world in that context, would systematic theology make sense to them?
Not really.
Mm-mm.
As far as ancient Near East, like Babylon and
Mhm.
Syria and everything,
Yeah.
I don't think it would make sense to them having some sort of systematic theology, even with all the gods that they worship. I don't think that they would have had some sort of systematic theology at all. No.
Right, because it's about participation and relationship.
Yeah, they would
And
participate
yeah.
in the worship of their gods, but and do the sacrifices. If we're talking Old Testament, they would do the sacrifices, and that was really. But they participated, so it was woven into their society too, as far as worship God, sacrifices, and festivals. And you see this the same thing in the Old Testament, where but it's not God, it's God, it's Yahweh, and they're called to participate in the festivals, the worship, and the sacrifices as well. Namely, the peace and fellowship offerings, not so much the sin, but sin gets in the way because, like you said, it's messy. So,
Right, because they didn't separate the everyday from the spiritual. To them, that was the same thing. And that's one of the things that systematic theology does is it tries to bridge that gap between my everyday life and my spiritual life. And how does it all work? And having to understand how it all works, right?
mhm.
And I think it's really, really, really important because the ancient Near East mind wrote the Bible, right?
Yep.
And it doesn't start getting into this systematic framework until the Council of Trent and we start getting the schism and you start getting that divergence of East and West. And then you get, Catholicism had its thing that it did for a while, and you get the Reformation, and that really nailed double down on systematic, like, as and the Enlightenment really made it go crazy. Like, there's so many things in the development of human history that have broken all of that and broken all that down. But we understand in our practical daily existences that life is messy. And so, Adam, when you're reading the Bible, is that always clean and easy to understand?
No, it's not.
The
No,
Bible is messy. You mean you don't get
it's
out of
not
chapter
really.
3 of Genesis before the Bible gets
It
messy.
gets messy then, and yeah,
And it
messy
stays
from
messy. There
Genesis
is
3 on.
hard stuff in there, there is, but it's also, I love one of the other things that I love so much about the way that the Bible is put together is that God's honest about the messy.
Yeah,
God's honest with us about that. And so, when we're dealing with human history, it's messy. The Bible is messy. Everything is messy. So we have to, I think, as Christians, in being good participants in loving relationship with God, hold some tension between there's things that we don't know and we can't know because of our limitations of being post fall humans and the realities of who God is, and letting go a little bit of how everything has to work because it's not a car manual, right?
that's for sure.
Holding
Yeah,
these things in tension of wrestling with them, but being okay with I don't know. Americans don't like I don't know. So
yeah,
you have to sit with I don't know. And I think that's the important piece that's missing here, because someday Christ is going to return and everything is going to put back in the order that it's supposed to be. God is going to fix the messy. He's promised us that he's going to fix the messy. So being able to be like, okay, it's messy. I'm going to hold on to the sureties that I have, wrestle with the things I don't know, and just trust, because God promised. He's the one who ordered it in the first place, and he's going to come back and reorder it
and
after we
bring it.
broke it.
Yeah,
So, you
exactly.
know, that is also the spirit that we hold following Torah, because it's messy. Loving God is messy. Loving your neighbor is messy. So having guidelines to point us in those things, because it is relationships are loving, relationships are reciprocal gift giving. And that's what Torah guides us to do. And that's why Torah compliance, in the fact that yes, it is reciprocal gift giving relationships between you and God and you and your neighbor, and the combination of all three of those things. So in that way, yes, we need to be participating in Torah. I'm going to change
Yep.
and start saying participating in Torah, because I think compliance has some weight and baggage to it that puts and
Yeah.
imposes some things on it that don't need to be there. It
Seems like it
poses some
should be.
systematics. It imposes some assumptions and adds weight that Christ and Romans and Hebrews says we are been removed from that weight. Don't put that weight back on yourself, because that's another thing that Romans and I think Galatians is dealing with. And Paul is saying, look, if you want to go back to being pre-Christ and try to find Christ again, because that's where you're going to end up, because that's where Torah ends up, you're going to take on all that burden and weight again, and then end up right back where you are right now. So don't do that.
Yeah. Stop. Get some
Right.
help.
So anyway, all right. Any final thoughts on compliant, like Torah participation or Sabbath participation, or anything like that we've gone over that you thought we missed or needed to be said?
No, I think that's it.
All right, we have given you the definitive answer on Torah.
Yeah.
Right?
I'll just
Actually,
like,
it's a pretty good answer, I think. But
yeah.
oh, you're welcome, Cosmic Septic. He's one of my favorites. Um, I so boy, oh boy, we just both finished up a semester. Oh,
Yeah. Bushed.
yeah, we did, which is why this got pushed back a couple of weeks. And happy Mother's Day,
That's for
everybody,
sure.
tomorrow.
Yes. Happy Mummy's Day.
Uh, so my semester starts next week for summer semester, and you've got a good break for a while. So
I got a couple months and then I
so
start at it
where can
again.
people go find you, Adam, and what do you have coming up on your channel?
So you can find me on Linguas Amo, Linguasamo, on YouTube, where I nerd out on Old Testament stuff all the time. I create shorts. Usually try to do 2 shorts a week. And I will be doing a 20-minute, usually they're 10 to 20-minute videos weekly. I'll be able to start that probably next week or the week after on a regular basis throughout the summer. What I have upcoming is a response video. I've started writing the script for it, on the Exodus. It's a different view of the Exodus. I take a late view of the Exodus, and I will be responding to someone who is taking the early date Exodus. There's a dialogue there after their dialogue. It's a dialogue video I'm going to be responding to. If they wish to include me in that dialogue, that would be fantastic. I'm not so sure if they will, but that's what I got coming up. I'll probably convert some of my papers into videos because that's an easy way to create content sometimes. Uh, so that's what I've got coming up in the near future. I'll still continue shorts and videos.
All righty. So coming up for me, man, I got a lot of stuff coming up here. It's kind of crazy. I kind of accidentally packed a bunch of stuff into next week, and then I'm going to
Yeah,
take a little bit of a break, and then July, the end of July and August, I'm going to have a lot more content coming out again. But I'm going to have some stuff coming out. But so let's see what is on my schedule. Monday, Why Leviticus Matters Part 2 is coming out. So I'm very excited about that, because we are digging into atonement. We are going to wade into that war there. So we are digging into the atonement. We are going to talk about it, what it means, what it is, how it all kind of works. We're going to really tear apart Leviticus. It's going to be, I've been, the conversations that have been going on with that crew has been amazing. I have just learned a ton. I've got more about atonement than I ever wanted to know, and there's so much more to learn on this. So I'm really excited about that.
Should be
And
around.
then over on Faith Unaltered, on Hebrew Bible Breakdown, next week we have sorry, we're going to do an episode talking about Bible study tools, websites like Step Bible and some of those other ones, Blue Letter Bible, some of those free online ones. And then we're also going to talk about Accordance and Logos and Olive Tree. And I got a guy from Logos who's going to come, and um, he's got a history working with some of those other softwares and resources. But we're also going to talk about, because I use Logos all the time for everything, so we're going to talk about
Same.
that one a lot more too. But we're going to talk about Bible study tools, how to use them, and we're also going to talk about, in that conversation, biblical languages and how to use those tools responsibly with biblical languages, because sometimes you can see people get things very, very wrong when they're trying to research and study a word and they don't know the language. And so I was one time, okay, I'm in a rabbit trail on this for just a second because I know you'll appreciate this one to Adam a lot, right? So
Yep.
one time I was on a live stream with somebody, and I'm not going to name names, but actually one or two of the people in watching this right now might actually remember this because I know that Deborah was there for this. But I was on a live stream with somebody, and they were trying to prove a point about something, and they pulled up their, I think it was Step Bible or something, and they're like, "Oh, look, this word, this Hebrew, it happened to be a Hebrew word." So I was like,
Oh wow.
that was your first mistake right there, and to not pull up
Yeah.
the Greek, to pull up the Hebrew, right?" But because it was an Old Testament verse, I think. But anyway, so like, see, this word means this, and when I looked at mine, when I pulled up my Logos and I looked at mine, it was a call, third person, imperfect, and they were trying to
Okay.
use the Hipfael meaning for it that only occurred once somewhere else in the Bible. Like, look, this is what this word means. No, no
No.
imaginary universe is a Hipfael meaning for a call verb going to work in that context, in that verse. It just isn't. So I had to, as lovingly as possible, tell them why they were completely wrong about that, because that's not how Hebrew works. Like, so we're gonna talk about
Word.
being, using them. They're helpful and they're valuable tools, but you also need to have,
Call it.
a Bible nerd friend who knows some of these original languages, or tools like, some of these other things that help you interact with the original languages, so that you understand that you don't mix up verb tenses and pick a meaning from a different verb tense, because that's not how those things
That's not how
work.
it
So you
works.
can't
That's not how any
you
of this
can't use
works.
a Hipfael meaning for a call verb. It's just not a
No.
thing. It's just not a thing at all. So we're going to talk about that. And then next Monday, I'm really excited about this. Next Monday, Nick Quint and Leighton Flowers are coming, and we're going to
Nice.
talk about why it's important to read the Old Testament in the Tanakh order, because it changes the story. It doesn't change the destination where you get to, but it changes some of the nuance, and it changes some of the things that you learn, and it changes some of the imagery, right? So
Hmm.
like the easiest one that I like to talk about with people, and I'm going to rabbit trail on this again because it's my channel and I can, um, is when you're going through in the Protestant canon that we have, right? It's Joshua,
Yeah.
Judges, Ruth, and then you dive into the Samuels, right? So when
Hmm.
you're reading the book of Ruth, and it's in that order, and if you're reading it in that order, you get to the end of Ruth, and here they're making a big deal about the genealogy of David, and you're like, huh? Especially if you've
Yep.
never read through it before, you're like, what is the big deal? But when you put it within the Tanakh, it's after Song of Solomon, Song of Songs, Song of Solomon, whichever way you want to say that. When you put it there, now all of a sudden you've got this, as because Hebrew does this really beautiful thing that I love so much, is it will take this abstract concept, and then it will show you by living out the practical way this works, like faith and
Yep.
works, right? Same thing.
Ruth
Faith is
is a
the
good example
abstract,
of that.
works is the way that you see it because it's lived out, right? So
Yep.
in trying to show God's loving relationship with Israel, you've got Song of Solomon and this dialogue back and forth about this loving relationship that God wants with Israel. And how does that play out? The book of Ruth lives that out. And now, because you've got all of the Solomons behind you, that you've read them already, and you're reading the book written by the son of David, now all of a sudden the ending the book of Ruth with the genealogy of
Makes
David
sense.
makes a whole lot more sense. Now you're
Yep.
like, oh, and when you end with Chronicles instead of Malachi, hello, that changes a lot in the way that you understand the story of the Old Testament. So yeah, so Leighton Flowers and Nick Quint are coming on Monday to talk about that. So I'm very excited about that video. That's going to be
Ooh,
a lot of fun.
that sounds like fun
And
too.
then we've also got, I think that's it. I think I've got just those 3 more. I don't know.
Gotcha.
I've got so many packed in there that I don't even remember. But and then the semester starts up for me again on Thursday. So I got intertextuality, which is going to be fun because I'm really excited about that class. Because intertextuality, that's like, I love intertextuality. It's one of the really fun. So for those of you who don't know, intertextuality is taking references between books and between testaments and seeing how they link together and what do those. So in when you see in the New Testament Jesus, is called the good shepherd. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's go back into the Old Testament and let's look at everywhere the shepherd imagery is used in the Old Testament. And that's going to help us understand what that means, that Jesus is the good shepherd, because it's pulling all of that with you. And it's those links in the Old Testament that kind of help you understand that, right? So that's a lot of fun. So, all right, everybody. Wow. So hopefully we have gone through and talked about why participating in Torah and participating in the Sabbath is a good idea. Adam, thank you again for
Yeah.
joining. It's always a pleasure. We always have
Yeah.
so much fun
It
when we
is.
go through
Yeah.
this. And we've got one more part of this, and we're going to have part 5, which is Jesus and Torah. And what does that all mean? How does that all work? Is Jesus Torah? Did Jesus write Torah? We're going to get into all those questions. And so keep an eye out for that coming up here in a little bit. And but thank you everybody so much for tuning in. Enjoy your weekend. Please go call your mother and tell her thank you so much. And Adam, we
Good.
will see you again for the next episode, the
Absolutely.
final part of the Torah series. All right,
All
everybody,
right. Look forward to
go
it.
and dwell more deeply every day with God.